The Persian rug in my living room, the one my husband and I had bought on our trip to Istanbul 30 years ago, was rough against my old, aching knees. My daughter-in-law, Sylvia, placed the plate on the floor in front of me, just beyond the edge of the rug, on the cold, hard, polished wood. It was a plate of my own food, from a meal I had just cooked for the entire family, in my own kitchen. "The dining room table is for family, Agnes," she had announced just moments before, her voice as smooth and as cold as the ice in her water glass. The whole family was there. My son, Robert, his wife, Sylvia, and my 2 teenage grandchildren, watching. "And since you are now a guest in our home, and we are so generously taking care of you, we thought it best to create a special little spot for you, so you don't feel left out." She smiled then, a small, triumphant, and deeply, deeply cruel smile. My son, her husband, my child, said nothing. He just stared at the television, his face a mask of resolute, cowardly indifference. My grandchildren snickered, a quick, embarrassed, and deeply wounding sound. I looked down at the plate of roast chicken and potatoes on the floor. I looked at the fork and the knife lying beside it on the bare wood. And I felt a humiliation so profound, so absolute, that it was a physical sickness, a cold, metallic taste in the back of my throat. I was 80 years old. I had been a nurse for 45 years. I had saved lives. I had raised a son. I had built a life of dignity and respect, and I was now being told to eat my dinner off the floor, like a dog. But as I reached down, my hand trembling with a rage that was so pure, it was almost silent, a different part of my brain, the nurse part, the part that was cool and clinical and deeply, deeply methodical, began to take over. I looked at Sylvia, at her smug, self-satisfied face, at her perfect, glowing health. And I began to think. I thought about human anatomy. I thought about the delicate and easily disrupted ecosystem of the digestive tract. I thought about the subtle, powerful, and utterly untraceable effects of certain common household herbs and supplements when administered in just the right dosage, over just the right period of time. I thought about the ingredients for a case of severe, debilitating, and medically baffling vertigo. I thought about the recipe for a month of agonizing and completely inexplicable stomach cramps. She wanted me to eat on the floor. Find out a long. But I, a woman who had spent a lifetime understanding the frailties of the human body, was about to make a promise to myself. In a few weeks, she would be crawling on it. "Hi everyone, I'm Grandma Agnes. I'm 80 years old. And my daughter-in-law, in the house that I own, just made me eat my dinner off the floor. She thinks she is punishing me. She has no idea that she has just handed me a weapon. The secret I am sharing with you today is not that I have a hidden fortune or a secret will. The secret is that I was a registered nurse for 45 years. I was a damn good one. I worked in oncology, in palliative care, in the places where the human body is at its most fragile, its most mysterious. I have a deep and deeply, deeply practical knowledge of pharmacology. I understand how the human body works, and more importantly, I understand how to make it stop working properly, in ways that are subtle, confusing, and almost impossible for a doctor to diagnose. My daughter-in-law sees me as a frail, helpless, and slightly senile old woman. A burden. A problem to be managed. She has no idea that she is living in a house with a woman who has a master's-level understanding of how to induce a case of chronic, debilitating, and medically baffling gastrointestinal distress. She has mistaken my quiet, grieving silence for weakness. She has mistaken my age for incompetence. She is about to learn that you should never, ever underestimate a retired nurse, especially one you have just, so cruelly and so foolishly, pushed too far. So please, get comfortable. This is a story about a woman who was treated like an animal, and who decided to respond not with anger, but with the cold, quiet, and deeply satisfying precision of a medical experiment. It is the story of how I turned my own kitchen into a laboratory, and my daughter-in-law into my first and most deserving human trial. Your support Your likes and subscriptions to Grandmother's Diary are the quiet, steady hand that will help me administer the first and most necessary dose. To understand the woman who would force an 80-year-old nurse to eat on the floor, you have to understand the life of care, of competence, of quiet, professional dignity she was so desperate to undermine. You have to understand the angel of mercy she pretended to be, and the jealous, insecure, and deeply, deeply cruel woman she truly was. My life, before all this, was a life of service. My late husband, my dear Robert, was a doctor, a brilliant and compassionate general practitioner. And I was his partner, in life and in work. I was an oncology nurse at the same hospital where he practiced. We were a team, a quiet, formidable force against the chaos and the pain of the world. Our life was not about money or about status. It was about our work. It was about the quiet, profound satisfaction of healing, of caring, of bringing comfort to those who were suffering. Our home was a sanctuary from the world of sickness and of pain. A quiet, comfortable, and deeply peaceful place. We raised our son, our Michael, in this world of quiet, compassionate service. We taught him the value of kindness, of empathy, of a life lived in the service of others. Michael was a good boy, a gentle, artistic soul. He did not inherit our love of medicine, but he inherited our quiet, compassionate nature. He became a high school art teacher, a man who found his joy not in the hustle of the world, but in the quiet, creative potential of his students. He was a good man, a kind man, and like so many kind and gentle men, he was a terrible judge of character. He met Sylvia in his late 20s, and she was a whirlwind, a beautiful, charming, and deeply, deeply insecure woman. She was a personal trainer, a woman obsessed with the surface of things, with physical perfection, with health fads, with the latest and often most ridiculous wellness trends. She saw the world not as a place of quiet, compassionate service, but as a hostile environment full of toxins and germs and hidden dangers that she had to constantly and vigilantly fight against. She was, from the very beginning, deeply intimidated by me. I was not just her boyfriend's mother. I was a medical professional, a woman of science, of reason, of a quiet and unshakable competence. And she, a woman whose entire worldview was built on a foundation of pseudoscience and internet-diagnosed anxieties, saw me as a threat. She saw my quiet, professional knowledge as a judgment on her own, deeply insecure and utterly baseless beliefs. The war between us was a quiet and deeply, deeply passive-aggressive one. It was a war of 1,000 tiny and deeply, deeply insulting skirmishes. It was a war of whispered comments, of condescending advice, of a constant and deeply, deeply draining campaign to undermine my authority, my knowledge, and my very identity as a caregiver. After my Robert passed away, and my own health began to falter after a bad fall, I made the foolish and deeply, deeply regrettable decision to move in with them. It was supposed to be temporary, just until I was back on my feet. But Sylvia, my loving and ever so helpful daughter-in-law, saw her chance. She became my caregiver, and in doing so, she became my warden. Her first move was to take over my diet. I, a woman who had spent 45 years advising cancer patients on their nutritional needs, was suddenly being treated like a child who could not be trusted to feed herself. She put me on a series of bizarre and deeply, deeply unpleasant health fad diets. 1 month, it was an all-kale and quinoa diet that left me weak and anemic. The next, it was a raw food-only diet that gave me constant and deeply, deeply embarrassing digestive issues. The next, it was a gluten-free, dairy-free, joy-free diet that made every meal a bland and deeply, deeply depressing ordeal. When I would try to protest, to gently suggest that a balanced diet might be more beneficial to an 80-year-old woman's health, she would look at me with a pitying, condescending smile. "Oh, Agnes," she would say, her voice full of a false, sweet sympathy. "I know it's hard to keep up, The science changes so fast. The things you learned in nursing school are so outdated. You just have to trust me. I've done the research. Her research, I knew, consisted of a few misinformed articles she had read on a wellness blog. The second stage of her campaign was to take over my medical care. She would accompany me to my doctor's appointments, and she would speak for me. She would interrupt me, she would contradict me, she would clarify my symptoms for the doctor. She would paint a picture of me as a confused and deeply, deeply unreliable old woman. "She's so forgetful, doctor," she would say with a sad, worried shake of her head. "You really can't trust what she says." And the doctors, busy, overworked, and faced with a beautiful, articulate, and deeply, deeply concerned-looking daughter-in-law, would often, to my horror, believe her. The final stage of her takeover was my exile. It began with her insisting that I eat my meals in my room on a tray. "It's for your own good, Agnes," she had said. "The noise and the chaos of the family dinner table is too much for you. You need a quiet, calm environment to eat." Exactly. And then, a few weeks ago, came the final and most humiliating blow. She had decided to turn my bedroom into her new home office and yoga studio. My bed was moved into the small, cramped and windowless guest room in the basement. And my meals, which had once been served on a tray, were now to be served on the floor of the living room, in the corner, like a dog. It was not about my health. It was not about my well-being. It was about power. It was about control. It was about her deep and deeply pathological need to be the sole and unquestioned authority in her own home. It was about her need to diminish me, to erase me, to turn the quiet, competent, and deeply, deeply knowledgeable old woman who was a constant and a silent threat to her own fragile and deeply, deeply insecure sense of self into a helpless and a pathetic and a completely and utterly powerless animal. And I, in my grief, in my exhaustion, in my desire to keep the peace, had let her. I had allowed her to strip me of my dignity, of my autonomy, of my very identity, piece by humiliating piece. Until tonight. Tonight, as I looked down at the plate of cold food on the floor, I finally understood. The war was not over. It had just entered a new, and far more interesting, phase. She thought she had won. She had no idea that I was a woman who had spent a lifetime studying the secret, and often invisible, ways in which the human body can be made to betray itself. And she had no idea that my quiet and deeply, deeply underestimated old hands were about to mix a cocktail of pure and righteous and deeply, deeply satisfying biological revenge. The lesson was about to begin. And the tuition, I decided with a small, cold, and deeply, deeply satisfied smile, was going to be a bitch. My first week as a dog was a week of quiet and deeply, deeply satisfying research and development. My new home, the small, windowless guest room in the basement, became my laboratory, and my prison became my fortress. Sylvia, in her arrogant and deeply foolish cruelty, had made a critical error. She had banished me to the one room in the house that was directly adjacent to the old pantry, a large walk-in closet where I had, for years, stored my own personal collection of herbs and supplements and old, forgotten nursing textbooks. It was my own, private, and deeply, deeply underestimated pharmacopoeia. She had, in her haste to erase me, forgotten it was even there. She had assumed that all of my old lady clutter had been thrown out years ago. She had no idea that I was a woman who believed in being prepared. A woman who had, for 50 years, been a quiet and deeply, deeply, deeply knowledgeable student of the subtle and often powerful effects of the natural world on the human body. During the day, I would sit on my bed, the plate of my cold, humiliating meal untouched on the floor, and I would plan. I would make lists. I would cross-reference my old dog-eared nursing manuals with the more esoteric and deeply, deeply useful herbalist guides I had collected over the years. I was a scientist, a researcher, a quiet and deeply motivated artist of biological warfare. My plan was not to poison her. Poison is crude. It is detectable. It is messy. My plan was to rebalance her, to create a symphony of symptoms so subtle, so confusing, so utterly and completely baffling, that it would drive her and her doctors to the brink of madness. I was not going to kill her. I was going to dismantle her, cell by miserable cell. My first target was her gut. The digestive system, I knew, was the great, and often overlooked, battlefield of the human body. It was a delicate and easily disrupted ecosystem. And Sylvia, with her obsession with fad diets and cleanses, and her constant and deeply misguided war against toxins, had already weakened her own defenses. She was a fortress with its gates wide open. I chose my weapons with the care and the precision of a master chef. A combination of 3 simple and utterly untraceable ingredients. First, a high dose of milk thistle, a common and seemingly harmless liver support supplement. I had a large economy-sized bottle of it in the pantry. In small doses, it was beneficial. In high, sustained doses, I knew it could cause a persistent and deeply unpleasant low-grade nausea. Second, a tincture of valerian root, another common and seemingly innocent herbal remedy for sleeplessness. A few drops were calming. A few too many drops, I knew, could induce a state of groggy, disoriented, and deeply unsettling vertigo. And third, my masterpiece, the secret ingredient that would tie it all together. A small and very potent dose of senile, a powerful and deeply effective natural laxative. The delivery system was her morning smoothie, her sacred and deeply self-righteous morning ritual. A foul-tasting concoction of kale and spirulina and a dozen other overpriced and utterly useless green powders. She made it herself every morning in a high-powered blender, and she drank it with the smug, self-satisfied air of a woman who believes she is cheating death itself. My opportunity came in the dead of night. I crept up from my basement laboratory, a ghost in my own house, and I went to the kitchen. I opened the capsules of milk thistle, and I ground the senna leaves into a fine, undetectable powder. I mixed them along with a few generous drops of the valerian tincture into her container of spirulina powder. It was a perfect camouflage. A few dark and deeply malevolent specks of dust in a sea of green. And then I waited. The first signs of my success appeared 2 days later. I was sitting on the floor of the living room, my back against the wall, reading a book, when Sylvia came stumbling into the room, her hand pressed to her stomach. She was pale, her face a sickly, greenish white. "Ugh," she groaned, slumping onto the sofa. "I think I have a stomach bug. I feel weird." "None." I looked up from my book, my face a mask of calm, quiet, and deeply satisfying concern. "Oh dear," I said, my voice a soft and utterly innocent murmur. "I'm so sorry to hear that. Can I get you anything? A glass of water? A cup of tea?" "No," she snapped, her voice a sharp, irritable thing. Just leave me alone." The symptoms continued for the next week. The persistent, low-grade nausea, the sudden, disorienting bouts of dizziness, the frequent and deeply embarrassing trips to the bathroom. She was a woman at war with her own body, and she was losing. She blamed everything. The new, organic kale she had bought at the farmer's market, the water from the tap, the air itself. She never for a moment suspected her sacred and deeply trusted spirulina powder. And she became a monster. Her already thin and deeply fragile veneer of charm and civility was stripped away, revealing the raw, ugly, and deeply insecure shrew that lay beneath. She was irritable. She was angry. She was a tyrant, ruling over her small and deeply deeply unhappy. Kingdom with a fist of pure and impotent rage. My son, of course, bore the brunt of it. Their arguments, which had once been quiet, passive-aggressive affairs, became loud and ugly and deeply, deeply satisfying to overhear. "I don't know what's wrong with me, Michael," she would wail, her voice a high, thin, and utterly pathetic thing. "I feel terrible. I'm doing everything right. I'm eating clean. I'm exercising, and I feel like I'm dying." "Maybe you should see a doctor, honey," he would say, his voice a low, weary, and deeply, deeply unhelpful sigh. "A doctor?" she would shriek. "What do they know? They'll just tell me to take a pill. They don't understand the body. They don't understand true health." And she would, of course, eventually go to a doctor. A series of doctors. And they would, of course, find nothing wrong with her. Her blood tests would come back normal. Her scans would be clear. They would diagnose her with stress, with anxiety, with a classic case of "it's all in your head." And with every normal test result, with every confused and deeply, deeply patronizing shrug from a medical professional, she would become more and more convinced that she was the victim of a vast and a deeply, deeply mysterious conspiracy. A conspiracy of toxins, of chemicals, of a world that was trying to poison her. She never, for a single, solitary, and deeply, deeply satisfying moment, suspected the quiet, invisible, and deeply, deeply underestimated old woman who was sitting on the floor in the corner of her living room, watching her, with a small, secret, and deeply, deeply righteous smile. The experiment was a success. The first phase of my quiet and deeply, deeply satisfying biological war was complete. And I, the old and frail and utterly powerless dog, was just getting warmed up. The kitchen was my laboratory. And I had a whole and deeply, deeply deserving list of new and far more interesting experiments to run. The crawling was about to begin. Phase 2 of my quiet and deeply, deeply satisfying little war began a month after the initial onset of Sylvia's mysterious illness. She was a wreck. A beautiful, expensive, and utterly miserable wreck. She had lost weight. Her skin, once her pride and joy, was sallow and broken out. Her eyes were constantly darting, her hands never still. She was a woman living in a state of siege, under constant and invisible attack from her own body. Her life had shrunk. Her thriving personal training business had withered. She had no energy, no patience, no ability to project the radiant and utterly fraudulent image of health and wellness that was her stock in trade. Her social life, once a whirlwind of lunches and parties and charity events, had ground to a halt. She was too sick, too tired, too unpredictable. She had become a hermit, a prisoner, in her own beautiful and deeply, deeply unhappy home. And I, her silent, invisible, and deeply, deeply underestimated warden, watched it all from my throne on the living room floor. And I knew it was time to escalate. My first campaign had been a quiet, internal one, a war fought in the secret, hidden battlefields of her own digestive tract. My second campaign was going to be a public one, a war fought on the terrain she valued most, her social standing, her reputation, her perfect and utterly fraudulent public image. My target was her annual and very lavish garden party. It was the highlight of her social calendar, an event she planned for months, an event that was a showcase for her impeccable taste, her perfect home, her perfect life. It was a performance. And I, the quiet and deeply, deeply knowledgeable ghost in her machine, was about to rewrite the script. My weapon of choice was a simple and beautiful and deeply, deeply misunderstood little flower, the Dactyrostromonium, known more colloquially as Jimson weed, or the devil's snare. I had a small and very discreet patch of it growing in a forgotten corner of my garden, a garden that Sylvia, in her arrogance, had long since abandoned as too much work. I had grown it for years, not for its notorious and deeply, deeply dangerous hallucinogenic properties, but for its beauty. The flowers were magnificent, trumpet-shaped blossoms that would open at dusk, releasing a heady and deeply, deeply intoxicating fragrance into the night air. But I was also a nurse. And I was a student of history. I knew the stories. I knew the power that was locked inside those beautiful, innocent-looking flowers. I knew that the pollen, in a high enough concentration, could be a powerful and deeply, deeply disorienting irritant. I knew that it could cause confusion and agitation and a mild and deeply, deeply unsettling form of temporary psychosis. My plan was simple, and it was elegant. I was going to turn her perfect, beautiful, and deeply, deeply self-important garden party into a scene from a Hieronymus Bosch painting. I began my preparations a week before the party. At night, when the house was dark and silent, I would creep out into the garden, my own, personal, and deeply, deeply satisfying garden of good and evil. I would carefully harvest the datura blossoms, my old gnarled hands moving with the precision of a surgeon. I would collect the pollen, a fine, yellow, and deeply, deeply potent dust in a small, airtight container. The day of the party was a beautiful, sunny, and deeply, deeply ironic Saturday in June. The garden was a picture of perfection. Sylvia, despite her illness, had rallied, summoning every last ounce of her strength to orchestrate her annual masterpiece. The caterers were there. The bartenders were there. The string quartet was playing softly on the lawn. And I, the quiet and deeply, deeply underestimated guest of honor, was sitting in my usual spot on the living room floor, watching. My delivery system was a stroke of pure and deeply, deeply satisfying genius. I had, in my years as a nurse, become an expert in the art of aerosolization. I had a small, travel-sized, empty perfume atomizer. I filled it with the datura pollen, and then I waited for my moment. The guests began to arrive, a flock of beautiful, expensive, and deeply, deeply self-absorbed peacocks and peahens. Sylvia was in her element, gliding among them, a glass of champagne in her hand, her face a mask of radiant and utterly fraudulent hospitality. I made my move when the party was at its peak, when the garden was full of people, of laughter, of the loud and deeply, deeply meaningless chatter of the city's elite. I crept out the back door, unseen, unheard, a ghost in my own garden. And I found my target, the large industrial-sized fan that Sylvia had rented to keep her guests cool in the afternoon sun. I stood behind it, a small, gray, and utterly invisible old woman. And I sprayed. I released a fine and deeply, deeply malevolent mist of datura pollen into the fan's powerful, rotating blades. The effect was not immediate. It was slow. It was subtle. And it was beautiful. It began with the sneezing. A few isolated sneezes at first, and then more and more, until the entire garden was a symphony of loud and deeply, deeply unladylike sneezes and coughs, and watery, red-rimmed eyes. And then the confusion started. People began to look at each other with a strange and deeply, deeply unsettling sense of disorientation. Conversations would trail off mid-sentence. Laughter would sound a little too loud, a little too long. People would forget where they were, what they were saying, who they were talking to. And then the madness began. A woman, a prominent lawyer's wife, began to swat at invisible insects, her arms flailing wildly. A man, a wealthy investment banker, began to have a loud and deeply, deeply one-sided argument with a garden gnome. Another woman, a well-known socialite, burst into tears, convinced that the string quartet was playing a song about her own secret and deeply, deeply scandalous love affair. The garden party had devolved into a scene of pure and deeply, deeply satisfying chaos. It was a beautiful and a deeply, deeply surreal and a deeply, deeply hilarious madhouse. And Sylvia, the perfect hostess, the the queen of her own, perfect, and now utterly, utterly ruined, kingdom, stood in the middle of it all, her face a mask of pure, uncomprehending horror. She watched as her perfect party, her perfect guests, her perfect life, descended into a scene of pure and deeply, deeply satisfying madness. My son, David, who had been trying and failing to calm the hysterical socialite, finally looked at his wife, at the wreckage of her party, at the madness in her eyes. And in his own, I saw not confusion, not anger, but a dawning and a deeply, deeply terrifying kind of clarity. This was not a stomach bug. This was not stress. This was not all in her head. This was something else. This was something dark, and something strange, and something that was so far beyond his own, quiet, logical, and deeply, deeply unimaginative comprehension that it broke him. He looked at his wife, at the madhouse she had created. And then, he looked at the house. He looked at the open living room window. And he looked at me. And he saw me, sitting in my chair, my knitting in my lap, my face a mask of calm, quiet, and utterly, utterly serene, innocent. And in my eyes he saw not a victim. He saw not a dog. He saw not a frail, and helpless, and slightly senile, old woman. He saw a scientist. He saw a nurse. And he saw a woman who had finally, and completely, and deeply, deeply satisfyingly had enough. The war was not over. But the battle had just been won. And the enemy was, finally, beginning to understand who she was fighting. The silence that descended upon the house after the last, confused and deeply, deeply irritated, guest had finally departed was a beautiful and deeply, deeply satisfying thing. It was the silence of a battlefield after a decisive and utterly unexpected victory. My son, Michael, and his wife, Sylvia, stood in the wreckage of their perfect garden party. The lawn was littered with overturned glasses, half-eaten plates of food, and the bewildered and deeply, deeply unsympathetic faces of the catering staff. Sylvia was a woman broken. She was trembling, her beautiful, expensive dress stained with wine and grass. Her face was a pale, sweaty, and deeply, deeply unattractive mask of pure, unadulterated terror. She looked at me, at the quiet, old woman who was still sitting on the living room floor, and her eyes were wide with a new and deeply, deeply gratifying kind of fear. It was not just the fear of a woman who is losing her mind. It was the fear of a woman who is beginning to suspect that her madness is not a random, unfortunate, and deeply, deeply unfair affliction. It was the fear of a woman who is beginning to suspect that her madness is a punishment, a well-deserved, and deeply, deeply satisfying punishment. My son, Michael, was a different story. He was a man who had just been forced to confront a reality that was so far beyond his own quiet and deeply, deeply limited comprehension that it had shattered him. He looked at his wife, at her wild eyes, at her trembling hands. He looked at me, at my calm, quiet, and deeply, deeply unnerving serenity. And he looked at the wreckage of his life. "What is happening, Sylvia?" he whispered, his voice a raw, broken thing. "What's going on?" "It's her!" she shrieked, her voice a high, thin, and utterly unhinged sound. She pointed a trembling finger at me. "It's the old witch! She's doing this to me! She's poisoning me! She's trying to drive me mad!" My son looked at me. He looked at his hysterical, raving wife. And he did what all weak, and frightened, and deeply, deeply inadequate men do when faced with a choice between a difficult and terrifying truth and an easy and comforting lie. He chose the lie. "You need to rest, honey," he said, his voice a low, soothing, and deeply, deeply pathetic murmur. You're not well. It's the stress, the pressure. I'm going to call your doctor. We're going to get you some help." He led her away, his arm around her trembling shoulders, a man leading his own, beautiful and deeply, deeply insane, wife to her own, private and deeply, deeply deserved, little hell. I sat there, on the floor, and I watched them go. And I felt a profound and a deeply, deeply satisfying sense of peace. The war was not over, but the enemy was in full retreat. And I, the old and frail and utterly, utterly underestimated nurse, was about to prepare my final and most devastating dose of reality. The crawling was about to become a permanent condition. So what is the final lesson from my long and deeply, deeply satisfying little science experiment? It is that the human body is a beautiful and a fragile and a deeply, deeply mysterious thing. And it does not take kindly to being disrespected. My daughter-in-law, in her arrogant and deeply foolish war against her own imaginary toxins, had forgotten the first and most important rule of medicine. First, do no harm. And she had, in her cruelty, in her ignorance, in her profound and deeply, deeply satisfying stupidity, done a great deal of harm. To me, and to herself. I also learned that knowledge, real knowledge, the kind that is learned through years of study, and of practice, and of quiet, and of deeply, deeply humble observation, is a powerful and a beautiful, and a deeply, deeply satisfying weapon. My daughter-in-law had her wellness blogs, her internet gurus, her expensive and utterly useless green powders. I had my nursing degree, my knowledge of pharmacology, and a small, but deeply, deeply effective patch of dachrystromonium in my backyard. And it was not a fair fight. My life is different now. I have reclaimed my home. My son, after a long and a difficult and a deeply, deeply necessary period of deprogramming, has finally come to his senses. He has divorced his wife, the beautiful and deeply, deeply insane health guru, who is now a permanent resident of a very exclusive and a very expensive private psychiatric facility. He has apologized to me. A deep and a profound and a deeply, deeply satisfying apology. Our relationship is a work in progress, but it is a relationship that is built not on lies, or on fear, or on the shifting, and deeply, deeply unreliable sands of his wife's latest health fad, but on a new and a solid and a deeply, deeply satisfying foundation of respect. And me? I am no longer a dog on the floor. I am the queen of my own, quiet and deeply, deeply satisfying little kingdom. I eat my meals at my own dining room table, on my own beautiful and deeply, deeply cherished china. And I am, for the first time in a very long time, at peace. Thank you for joining me on this journey. It has been a story of great cruelty, but also of a surprising and a deeply, deeply satisfying kind of justice. Your support has been a constant source of strength. If my story has moved you, or made you look at that old bottle of herbal supplements in your own medicine cabinet with a new and a deeply, deeply healthy sense of suspicion, alike, or a subscription to Grandmother's Diary, would be a profound honor. Remember to always trust the science, and never, ever underestimate a quiet and a deeply, deeply knowledgeable old nurse. Be well and be wise. I'll see you in the next story. Love, Grandma Agnes.